Hello, everybody. This is I suppose it's the sort of fifth or sixth video. It's the fourth proper video in our rundown of Christopher Nolan's 10 movies on the lead up to Tenet's release. We're reviewing each of them based on a kind of rather arbitrary ordering system we put in. And so far, we've reviewed three of his movies, following Insomnia and Memento, which happened to be his first three movies. Just to remind ourselves of the orders we put things in, we'll have a quick look at what we did. I'm joined as always by Matt. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Nick.
I'm just going to show your list just to remind people who've been following this as to the order that they were put in. That was your list there. So you ran with the following Insomnia. Today's review, which is Batman Begins, Inception, and then Memento, which of course we've already done. And then let's see if I can find my list on there. Then this was my list. I too went with the following at number 10 and Insomnia at 9. And then our lists deviated from each other a little bit. I had Dunkirk at 8 and Interstellar at 7. Yeah. And I had Batman Begins at 6. And the reason that we did Memento already was because that's number 5 on my list. So it was kind of around and about the same place. So I know it's probably a while since you've seen the list since we started doing all these. Any regrets so far at the way you've ordered them?
Yeah, thinking about this video, it's probably switch Batman Begins and Inception.
Okay.
Inception down my list.
It gets moving further down.
Yeah, kind of but saying that the only one of two films that I wanted to watch again straight away, Inception was one of them.
Right. Okay. So what when we started doing this, or straight away after you'd seen it?
Yeah, when we started doing this.
Right, excellent. Yeah. Obviously that's one we'll get into in the sort of second half of this. But the aim is to, as I said, it's to do Batman Begins today, which was Nolan's 2005 film. It was actually his next movie after Insomnia. And seeing as we're going to kind of move on to this Batman film, we thought that would probably be best if we do the trilogy in order straight away. So after we've done this one, the next two will be The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, irrespective of where they ended up on our lists. And of course, neither of us know each other's lists. It'll be quite funny if either of those do turn up quite high up. Obviously, they're in the top 5. So Batman Begins, 2005, Nolan's fourth film, really, I guess. Can you give us a quick synopsis?
Yeah, well, as far as I'm aware, it's the first cinematic telling of the Batman origin story. Obviously, we've seen variations and shorter versions of it in all of the other adaptations of Batman. So after the death of his parents, it follows a young Bruce Wayne as he's searching for identity, really, and he's looking for purpose in life. And he finds it in, he wants to get revenge for the death of his parents. After a series of events, he goes around the world and again searching for identity, and he ends up in the hands of the League of Shadows, which is like a vigilante, maybe described as a terrorist organization. And he goes through some training, and then he returns to Gotham. And what he does when he gets back to Gotham, he's sort of trying to forge a new identity, and he creates the Batman character, and he tries to instill justice in Gotham City. And towards the end of the film, he faces the League of Shadows as they come back to Gotham and try and put an end to Western civilization.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of fairly straightforward movie, isn't it, in terms of that sort of simplicity that you'd expect from an adaptation of a comic book movie. To give it a bit of background, I suppose, in terms of its antecedents, that Batman had been a character since the 1940s. I think is it Bob Kane devised it, wasn't?
Yeah,
it was a DC comic, isn't it? Not quite as old as Superman, but certainly one of the oldest heroes to sort of be in comic books. I think most certainly my sort of Batman, or growing up, my memories of Batman was repeats of the 1960s TV series. I have to caveat that I wasn't old enough to watch it when it was originally broadcast, but it used to get shown quite a lot on British TV in the 1980s. so as a kid, I used to see that would be the Batman that I remember, which was an incredibly over the top, very camp, larger than life, almost a kind of tongue in cheek version of a comic book hero that's much loved by lots of people. And then something happened in 1989 when the sort of gothic filmmaker Tim Burton, who sort of many consider to be an auteur himself, surprised a lot of people, and this is going to sound familiar, by taking on this kind of very well-known existing role. Up until that time, Burton had been making quirky individual movies like Edward Scissorhands and Frankenweenie and stuff like that, but he gave it a sort of a new darkness and a kind of a quality that people hadn't seen, and that spawned a sequel and that he directed, and two more sequels which were directed by the filmmaker Joel Schumacher, who was a very big deal in the 80s and 90s. But they essentially descended into the same sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of send-up territory that the TV series had. And so Batman had a hiatus of, I think, around 8 years before Nolan took this project on. And he really put his own stamp on it in a way. I mean, not without its own influences. I think his Batman is based on some of the later comic books by people like Frank Miller, like Batman Year One, which were altogether a much sort of darker, violent, sort of grisly versions of Batman. But why did this really make its mark? Why why is this considered to be possibly the best incarnation of Batman to make it on screen?
Well, like you said, it's a departure from the former films, isn't it? As you said, the Batman films are highly stylized, and the Joel Schumacher films, it's almost like they completed the genre cycle by going back to the campy and ridiculous, over-the-top nature, very like self-aware films. And I think then Batman took a very well-deserved and needed break. And I think what Nolan had a big responsibility, didn't he? Because he had to like reframe Batman for a modern audience, like recontextualize the character in a way that it didn't like patronize the audience, and it adds a bit more deeper meaning, a bit more relevance for maybe a bit more of a, I don't know, sophisticated or turned on audience.
What sort of how does that manifest itself in that final product then? What makes this feel like a grown-up superhero movie, if you like?
Yeah, well, I think there's already been the start of the cycle. The cycle had already begun with X-Men in 1999, so we'd already got like a flavor of like the style and the aesthetic studios are going for. And I think one of the things that was so refreshing about Batman Begins was how different it was from that. It took, like, as we said, a big departure. But Nolan, he some of the things people say about these films to describe them as more serious is the darker, and they certainly are in tone. But I think it's more of a character study than a generic superhero film, isn't it?
Yeah. I was reading that one of the ambitions here was to build a character that the audiences might relate to, both the Bruce Wayne character and the Batman character as well. So Bruce Wayne is just as, if not more important than Batman throughout these movies. It's his trilogy, isn't it? It's Bruce Wayne's films. He's the one who decides he needs to, it's his motivations entirely, and Batman is just a costume and a symbol, which is they go at great lengths to tell us throughout all three films that Batman could be anyone. It's a symbol for what it stands for. But even so, it's funny that repeated line, Batman could be anyone, but it couldn't, because it's Bruce Wayne that is at the heart of every decision that's made and every action that happens. And in that role is Christian Bale, who's a childhood actor, actually, from 1980s, Welsh originally, although being a childhood actor in Hollywood, he's sort of lost any kind of accent, and depending on which interview you watch with him, he either has a sort of very British, almost Cockney accent, or a sort of an Americanized version. I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle, like sort of some sort of transatlantic type. But what do you think of the casting of him, and how does he do in the center of three movies?
I thought the casting was like perfect. I think that's mostly true of the entire trilogy and most of Nolan's films. And I think It's quite interesting thinking about Nolan, because I think he was like a big actor, obviously, but Batman's the film I think that really propelled him to like mainstream success. And his sort of journey as a celebrity it doesn't parallel the Batman character, but he had certain controversies off camera, didn't he, off screen?
Yeah, I wonder if sometimes part of the casting decisions was knowing that potentially he was that kind of loose cannon. That obviously someone who knows Hollywood inside out, so can work within a studio system, But at the same time, he was becoming more well known for perhaps doing these almost method parts. There was a film called The Machinist out in the late 90s, early noughties, where he was famous, lost incredible amount of weight, basically became a sort of skeleton version of himself. And I wonder if that dedication to character acting was something that appealed to Nolan, because he thought, if we're going to have to properly believe that this person would do these things, then we're going to need the kind of actor that will also live that part as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I think the audience's like relationship with Bale off screen, we had that. We see him in films, and he is like a morally good character, and we have certain ideas and expectations of him. But then in real life, he's got this darker side as well. And because that sort of mirrors with the Batman character, I think it makes the portrayal a lot more intriguing and a lot more grounded, which is another aspect of the style, isn't it? That it's a lot more realistic, and it's really, I say, more in the second two films, but they're really starting to ground it in a recognizable reality rather than like the Marvel films, which is more fantastical.
Yeah, definitely. That attention to realism was through every aspect, not just the script or the acting, but certainly the look and the feel of the film. Nolan wanted to move away completely from CGI. Effects are done realistically. Sets are actually built, miniatures used. Kind of old school filmmaking, really. The creation of Gotham as a city looks like a sort of cosmopolitan, modern 21st century city. It doesn't feel like it's sort of surrounded by CGI constantly. And Gotham itself becomes a kind of character throughout the films, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, what I found interesting watching it and thinking about like the evolution of the story and of Gotham and the characters throughout the trilogy is that this is still, I think, quite small in the grand scale of things for Nolan. I mean, some of the shots at the start of the film when Bruce is in Nepal or wherever he is, are very, it's got the big massive vistas and the amazing wide tracking shots. But as we get into Gotham, it's not really up in like the sky or like in the skyscrapers like it is in the second film. It's down in like the Narrows, isn't it, as they call it?
Yeah.
And saw an interview with Nolan where he said he drew heavily from like German expressionist style for that. It's very cramped and narrow and very dark.
So building on that sort of claustrophobia that we saw in other films like Memento and Following and Insomnia as well. Yeah, definitely. And I think that is in some way trying to create, I don't know if this was trying to set up some of the stuff in the later films, particularly Dark Knight Rises, but that almost a city that has sort of two levels based on the class society. The Narrows are very much an effort to try and create a sort of subterranean class that has almost been forgotten by the sort of wealthy and socialites of Gotham. Whether he pulls that off very well, I'm not sure. I think it's one of those things, was a great idea. Whether it kind of sees it through, I don't know. But certainly those scenes you talked about at the beginning, the training, which is something you haven't really seen in a Batman movie before, proper origin stuff. So, like you mentioned, the sweeping shots in Nepal, I love all that stuff. I think that's so open, so big. All that's what I think of when I think of Wally Pfister's cinematography. Is just this kind of really barren landscapes. How important is that to the film overall? Those kind of the big open spaces, the going to Nepal and seeing him do the training and stuff.
I think it's obviously important for Bruce's character development, but I think it like underlines some of the deeper themes in the film as well.
Right.
Bruce is just out for revenge, isn't he, at the start of the film?
Yes.
And that attempt for revenge in the courthouse is taken away from him. That obviously inspires a lot of anger, and he goes around the world, looking for identity, and which again is a theme of Nolan's work. But over the course of the journey, he learns that revenge isn't the way, and he starts promoting justice. And as you said before, he adopts a symbol, doesn't he? And what we get in the second half of the film is a clear binary, I think, between like the League of Shadows and Batman and Gotham. And I've seen some criticism of the film. You could easily call a certain take on the film that Nolan's quite conservative in his values because he's presenting, a white American billionaire as the standards for morality, and he's, fighting this shadowy Eastern organization.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, but that's going to be the issue with any film where you pick that central protagonist as a white wealthy billionaire. That's what comes part and parcel with it. I think potentially in the later films, more of an argument is the sort of almost glorification of vigilante justice. That brings its own problems, doesn't it? It's the idea of dealing with things outside of a law or a system, which means they have to. Because I don't think of Nolan as at all as a kind of right-wing filmmaker who espouses a kind of an old-fashioned Hollywood Western value that America's there to clean up and everyone else's mess. I think he goes at lengths to show that Gotham itself is wretched and rotten, and actually Bruce wants to try and save it via its people.
I agree, and I think it's like importance of not looking at films as individual texts, isn't it? Is that if those ideas that are placed in Batman Begins, at the end of the film, he has to reject violence, doesn't he? Really, and he sort of lets justice carry its course. And then in the second films, it's really, Batman, he has to really question his ways and his methods, doesn't he? And it becomes a lot more of an open allegory of a critique of American foreign policy and its view of terrorism, its view of itself.
Yeah, definitely. And as we get onto those films, we'll talk about the iconography that's used to, sort of hammer that message home to a certain extent, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult. I think Batman Begins is so good considering it's an origin story, and filmmakers will always be hamstrung by origin stories because it's all exposition a lot of the time. But you already kind of mentioned a couple of them. We've wandered into what makes this Nolan-esque territory, and you talked about the idea of identity being a key theme. So I suppose from now on, just because we've talked about other films and we're going to talk about this one, I guess it's fair to say we'll go for a little spoilers. So if you haven't seen Batman Begins, which I'm sure most people have, but from now on in we can talk about spoilers to a certain degree, because the first Nolan trait that I want to talk about is one that I've brought up a couple of times throughout the series, is again, it's to do with that sort of flawed hero role, but people who break their own rules. And of course, Batman, when Bruce decides to become Batman, he sets himself up with some very specific rules. And one, of course, is not to kill. No guns. He can only kind of maim or cripple his assailants, but he's not allowed to kill anyone. And at the end of the film, he says, I don't have to kill you to Ra's al Ghul, his enemy, but I don't have to stop you from dying. And of course, it's pretty much the same thing. So I don't buy that he didn't kill him. He does kill Ra's al Ghul, but it's clearly a character breaking their own rules, which we see, I think, in every single one of the films we've reviewed so far. The hero breaks the rules that they set up for themselves. Is that further evidence of this kind of flawed masculinity idea that Nolan portrays to us?
Yeah, and I think Batman's such an interesting character to look at for that, because I was thinking about the characteristics of his character and thinking what other typical characters is he similar to, and he's similar to like a cowboy. He's like that single, lone, no family. He's very typically male. But I think that decision at the end, when he in his mind, maybe, or in Nolan's message, that he rejects violence, because violence is always a shortcut to success, isn't it, for Hollywood men in American films. And because he maybe rejects violence, it's just, as I said earlier, it's the start of that critique of American identity, and through Bruce Wayne and Batman.
So in some ways, this is almost like a revisionist superhero movie, like the same ways that the Westerns were perhaps could be seen as allegories of the Second World War and America's difficult decision to drop the A bombs in that kind of man's got to do what the man's got to do. This takes the idea of a superhero who has to act outside of international law or outside of the judiciary, but it kind of justifies it by making him look at himself, by forcing how much power do I have? I mean, which of course is a theme that comes into Dark Knight. It's difficult not to move on to those, isn't it? But certainly Batman Begins, he takes a long, hard look at what he's going to have to do, and it's only because Gotham is so corrupt that he's able to justify his own actions.
Yeah.
But he slowly brings Gotham with him, doesn't he? Because is he Captain Gordon at the beginning of this film?
I think so.
Yeah, he's certainly not Commissioner Gordon, but we see that actually Batman is Bruce is instrumental in changing Gotham's identity as well, making Gotham a better place.
Yeah, I like that, and it's sort of like the tagline of the film, isn't it? Batman says, "It's what we do that defines us."
Yeah.
But talking about the end scene, I like the end scene because they're setting up the second film with the Joker, but it's quite a downbeat ending in a way because it's a lot of anxiety in the scene, isn't it? They're talking about like the threat that's growing.
Yes,
so that was quite interesting, and that's like a bit of a break from the mold.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in some ways, it sets up nicely for a franchise, but at the same time, it tackles the idea that these things don't necessarily have neat endings just because you've got something. Sorry, I'm aware that there's a tail that keeps passing by here. I've got the cat that's just jumped up here. This is Selena. No, not really. So that's Wendy, but she's. I just could see the tail moving across, and I thought people are going to wonder. That idea of no neat endings, that crime doesn't just stop because the superhero's there, it does carry on. And actually, dare I say it, that idea of challenging narrative a little bit, is this another Nolan thing where we're seeing a film about films? Does this, at the end of the movie, what's it called? Gotham, what's his name? Wayne Manor is burnt to the ground. And then he decides to rebuild it brick by brick. Is that Nolan telling us that he's destroying what you thought was a superhero movie, and then he's going to rebuild what we consider to be superhero movies?
Yeah, it's a very fitting metaphor at the end, isn't it? And I think we hit upon it earlier. Like I said, it's part of his responsibility to reframe it.
Yeah.
For the modern audience, which I think The Dark Knight really takes that mantle and runs with it, doesn't it? Like, everything about that is so different.
That's what elevates it, isn't it? Yeah. It's interesting. I saw interviewed Nolan that whilst he wanted to be true to the origin stories of Batman, where other films had deviated to suit their own narrative, one thing he does change is that in the original comic book series, Batman or Bruce Wayne's parents are shot in an alleyway after leaving the cinema. And in this, in Nolan's version, they're leaving the theatre. I think it's the opera, isn't it? They go see Fledermaus, the bat. So, but his reason for doing that was he didn't want to show a cinema within the film because he felt that would take people outside of the film, as it were, almost be too referential. In a way, I kind of, again, it's one of those things that it might be true, but I don't really buy this idea that he doesn't want us to not think about cinema. I think he does want us to think about cinema, but I think he wants us to think specifically about cinema. I think he doesn't want us to be distracted by it. I think he wants to rebuild his own version of cinema.
It comes back to a quote that I actually mentioned. I can't remember what video it was. Might have been an introduction video where Nolan talks about how he builds his world and the idea of looking down at a maze or looking down at a world and placing you in there with the character.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And we are. And it's, I think that goes back, I suppose, to that kind of realism aspect with all of his work, even his most fantastical or, the science fiction work or anything that's difficult to relate on at I know what that's like level. The baddies in this film are the lesser known ones, aren't they? You've got one called the Scarecrow, which is just a psychiatrist who uses sort of hallucinogens on his victims, and actually a mob boss is the sort of, I suppose, the main baddie, I guess, in this. It's sort of that Bruce deals with initially. So there's a kind of even at the sort of hero villain level, everything has a sort of builds on reality.
Yeah.
In that respect, I suppose.
Yeah.
The does this move Nolan's work on, though? I mean, we've talked about connections. How does this alter him kind of getting this big budget sort of franchise film? Does it change him as a filmmaker at all, do you think?
I think I would say firstly, the most obvious thing it does is just ramps everything up like to 11, if you like.
Yeah.
In terms of scale. A lot of the core themes and style is there, but I feel Batman Begins. This is maybe why I put it lower down on my list. It does feel not like an anomaly, but it does feel the least like his other films. You know what I mean? It doesn't sort of fit within his canon. Sometimes for me stylistically, because I think The Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises took more from like Inception and that sort of look, and he's developed that from there.
Yeah.
And it seems to culminate in Tenet. Actually, it's very almost like very whitewashed and blue.
I think in his desire to keep things realistic, I think obviously this I wouldn't have had the same budget as the later two, but things like creating the Narrows sometimes does feel a bit more like the sort of Tim Burton Gothic version of Gotham, rather than the big scale that we're used to for the second two. And you're right. I think, and again, maybe this is being hamstrung by an origin story. He doesn't have the same ability to muck around with narrative at all. He doesn't, I mean, the film starts in flashback and we get Bruce's childhood and so on. And obviously we do see his origins, but it doesn't do as much with narrative as his other movies.
No. I wonder how much of that is Nolan playing safe or whether that's like studio interference.
Yeah.
And I don't know. He wrote this script with, I think it was David. Is it
David
Goyer?
S. Goyer. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I don't know, like what their relationship was. Maybe was he the primary writer and Nolan was there to, submit ideas or so. And it's difficult for his first film of that scale.
Yeah,
Like you wonder what the dynamic is.
definitely.
Because right, I mean, the stuff in the Narrows is so obviously stylized and it draws attention to itself, especially when you see Batman with the red eyes.
Yes. Yeah.
That doesn't appear for me in any of his other films. Really, that change of style within a film.
It changes the tone as well, doesn't it? Because you're not quite sure whether there's going to be a sort of supernatural element. Of course, now with the MCU, I mean, it would be impossible for the MCU to create a film like the Dark Knight trilogy because so many of the characters have got abilities that aren't real, that are they're fantastical, that can't even be explained. Everything in the Batman Begins movie is explained. The armor, the Batmobile. As convoluted as it might be that the Wayne Enterprises has a kind of arms and R&D division and stuff like that, it's all explained into reality. You can't do that with superhero characters that are from another planet or wield fantastical powers, no matter how hard you try. And I know that the DC tried it, didn't they, with their Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman crossover, and probably why it's fallen so flat on its face, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I think Nolan's Batman was so successful and so iconic that it's almost like the character needs to be retired for like a decade or more, maybe, because people still watch these films and still like enjoy them, don't they? I mean, they've been re-released. They're some of the only films that have been re-released over summer as the cinemas have opened. It just shows the popularity of them, and now that for a lot of people is Batman. And you're right. I think DC made a mistake departing away from the realism and moving more into. They just tried to copy the Marvel model basically, and I think the Star Wars films have sort of fallen into that trap as well. But it looks like with Joker and the new Batman, we found like their way.
Yeah, possibly by keeping it as sort of separate from things as possible. It's an interesting take on it. This film took 350 million at the box office. I think that's domestically in the United States, which is obviously a huge amount of money. But when we get on to talk about the success of the latter two, it goes crazy, doesn't it? But was this? Can we point to the Batman Begins and obviously this trilogy to as part of our growing evidence that audiences can take a more sophisticated sort of blockbuster that the audiences want something that's a bit more challenging and cerebral for them, or is this just a really, really good action film that other people can, that another audience, an audience who wants something a bit more cerebral will go and see as well? Did he find a perfect crossover, or does this film change who we thought the mainstream were originally?
I think it's just both. I mean, and I think that is how, if that's how producers and studios should approach films. I think one of the things, with modern audiences, there could be a criticism that we've been dumbed down a little bit, and we just like these, popcorn movies that are all just generic. They're entertaining and stuff like that, but they're so shallow and they don't really offer anything. But films like this and films by Nolan in particular, the success of the films. He made Dunkirk, and it was a massive financial and critical success. It just proves that if we're offered better quality films, people will go and see them.
Yeah, but definitely.
I'm hoping that happens with Denis Villeneuve's career. He's quite similar to Nolan, maybe a bit more cerebral blockbuster. So we'll see how his career takes off, and hopefully we're seeing the end of a Marvel cycle, and hopefully these type of filmmakers can fill that void.
Did this? I mean, obviously, by this point, as you mentioned, the X-Men had started rolling, and that had become very successful. But this came out before. It came out around the middle of the time the Sony were in the middle of making their Spider-Man trilogy, but it came out before Iron Man, didn't it? I think.
Yeah, it was 2008.
Yeah. So is there, considering its success critically and commercially, are there? The MCU better than me. Are there any sort of influences that this had? Did it find its way? Did the influence of Batman Begins find its way into any of the MCU films at all?
I think that's a difficult one. Some of the films, Captain America in particular, took that approach of just being dark,
right?
And that somehow makes it like serious. They're actually, ironically, some of the only Marvel films I really like, actually. But so they took that approach. But I think because of the overarching narrative of the Infinity Stones and the very existence of magic and stuff like that, it's difficult. Like thematically, it's like it's totally different. It's just too big, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. There's too much. I suppose so. Yeah.
And Batman's very much about the individual. Like I can't imagine him working that, teaming up with other people, and the Marvel characters is such like an ensemble and collective unit that.
Yeah. And it relies on sort of a deeper level of symbolism that if you crowd it too much with other people, because I think that's what made the 60s TV series so over the top, is there's just abundance of baddie character after baddie character. They've all got their own quirks and traits, but this film centers so much on Bruce Wayne. I mean, Dark Knight Rises has got many critics, and we'll maybe talk about some of them. But that's a film that's 45 minutes in before Batman makes his first appearance, and even this one, I'd say it's probably the same amount of time before we see a man in a suit, isn't it? Which just shows the sort of commitment to tell a story about a man's journey, to use a cliche, or his desire to change a city for good, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's again like noticing again, watching the films again, how much time, especially Dark Knight Rises, I forgot how long it was until we see Batman properly in the film, and how much time we dedicate to Bruce across the entire trilogy.
That as well, I suppose that's another little Nolan theme as well, that obsession, because it's something that he can't, Bruce can't leave. It's something that he's advised to stop, and so on. And his obsession first with finding his parents, or bringing his parents to justice, to the parents' killer, and then trying to right the wrongs of other people. And so I think that obsessiveness is a key trait, isn't it, Nolan's, which adds to that flawed character. While we're on Nolan watch, I guess is this Michael Caine's first appearance?
Yeah. Prestige was after Batman Begins, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So Michael Caine's been in every Nolan film since this one, and also the first time Hans Zimmer's involved. Is that right?
Yeah. The first time they worked together, but reading about the film, there was 4 composers really.
Yeah.
think Hans Zimmer oversaw it, and there was 3 other composers. And I think, again, the music didn't really stand out necessarily to me. Mostly, you've got the main theme that travels across the other films. But yeah, this it just feels, you can still again feel a hand of the studio and like an external presence on the film, like containing it. And I think the success of those films then let the studios just let him do what he wants for the rest of those films.
I think by the time you get to Dark Knight Rises, Zimmer is in complete control of the music, and it's so much more of a powerful presence in the film. And I know we will talk about Zimmer a lot, but the music in Dark Knight Rises is one of the most underrated things about it. People seem to forget how powerful that is, I think. So yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, that's a lot of the stuff to look. I think we've trailered the next ones quite well there, but also given good justification as to why it's not quite in the sort of the 5-1. It's like you said, it's not quite a Nolan film. It doesn't quite live up to what the other 2 in the trilogy do. But it's like I said, it's always going to be a thankless task.
Yeah, I still love it. I mean, it's great, but it just, as you said, it just doesn't quite get the top 5.
It was the one, I think, it's one of the films that surprised me when we rewatched them all for this project with just how much I enjoyed it. Like it is, it is dark and it's serious and it's, it has a lot of these themes, but it is also a lot of fun. If you want to watch a great action movie, then put this on. Like it's if that's your if that's what you're feeling of a certain time, I want to watch an action movie, there's no reason why you shouldn't put this on. The seriousness of it or the cerebral nature of it doesn't bog it down at all, because there are some great action sequences in this, some great fight scene, everything you'd want from an action movie.
It can definitely be enjoyed on like multiple levels, can't it?
Definitely. Good. Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, hopefully we've plugged that, so anyone who hasn't seen it will go away and watch it, and hopefully we'll have some people who disagree with us as well. I know that the Dr. Mark Kermode of Radio 5 Live, amongst other places, this is his favourite of the trilogy. Certainly of the Dark Knight trilogy, he likes this one, but then maybe he's just being contrarian.
Yeah, I think so.
But yes, okay, so we've done 4 now. Like I said, the next one will be The Dark Knight, even though that's in both of our top 5, but we'll also use that as an opportunity to reveal 5-1 when we do that as well. Okay, but until then, thanks very much, Matt.
Yeah, thanks.
And we'll be back again with our next video. Bye-bye for now. Bye.